One quick fact before we begin. Vikings were more than just raiders. Vikings were famous for raiding kingdoms, surviving impossible battles, and becoming legends. But Bjorn became famous for something completely different. He had one unbelievable talent. He could fall asleep, absolutely anywhere. After one raid too many, his captain finally decided he'd had enough. So the crew came up with the most ridiculous punishment a Viking had ever received. Bjorn slept through the entire thing. And when he finally woke up, he was completely alone in the middle of the ocean. This is the story of the sleepiest Viking who somehow survived the dumbest punishment in Viking history. Most Vikings became legends by fighting. Bjorn had a slightly different strategy. Speed was every Viking captain's greatest weapon. Crew, however, was feeling unusually confident. They were ready to fight, ready to raid, ready to become legends, or at the very least, steal enough sheep to make the trip worthwhile. Their chief looked exactly how a Viking leader should, angry, fearless, and probably one bad decision away from invading somebody. Every warrior was ready. Well, almost every warrior. Then one Viking finally stopped shouting long enough to look around and discovered they were missing someone. Not a shield, not an axe. Bjorn. Suddenly everybody started looking around, which was impressive, considering none of them had noticed he was missing for the last 20 minutes. Nobody knew where Bjorn was, which somehow wasn't even the weirdest thing he'd done. Then, everyone's attention turned to one suspiciously quiet barrel. At first, everyone assumed it was the waves. They were wrong. Bjorn woke up, realized everyone was staring at him, and responded with the universal Viking apology, an awkward smile. The other Vikings couldn't believe what they were seeing. Bjorn couldn't believe everyone was making such a big deal out of it. The fleet sailed toward the enemy, although Bjorn was quickly becoming everyone's bigger concern. Most raids targeted small coastal villages. Bjorn finally looked toward the shore, and to absolutely no one's surprise except his own, they'd already reached the enemy village. The Vikings charged toward the village exactly as their ancestors had taught them, loudly, confidently, and with absolutely no concern for subtlety. The warriors raced toward the village, eager to earn glory, honor, and probably someone else's valuables. Gold wasn't the only treasure worth taking. The gates burst open, and the Vikings poured in like they owned the place. The Vikings spread through the village with remarkable efficiency, mostly at breaking things. After all the confusion, Bjorn finally found something he understood: free stuff. Bjorn quickly discovered that carrying loot was a lot easier than fighting for it. Bjorn found one final treasure, a mysterious little thing that kept making tiny clicking noises. As far as Bjorn was concerned, that settled it. So naturally, he found a hammock and went straight back to sleep. A few minutes later, someone noticed Bjorn was missing again. The chief took one look at Bjorn and immediately started questioning every decision he'd ever made. The chief screamed like the battle had just begun. Loading the loot often took longer than the battle. Outside, the Vikings were busy gathering everything worth taking: grain, tools, supplies, basically anything that wasn't nailed down. Bjorn glanced around in confusion. Everyone looked busy, which, unfortunately, included him. Ahead of him, a supply wagon had become hopelessly trapped in the mud, and no amount of Viking muscles seemed to help. Bjorn finally volunteered to help. The other Vikings watched with equal parts hope and concern. Then, with one lazy kick, the wagon suddenly shot forward. One kick had solved the problem, and immediately created a much faster one. Meanwhile, another Viking squad was locked in a fierce struggle with a barrel. Bjorn volunteered to help once again, and by now, everyone already knew how this was going to end. The barrel was free, and now everyone had to chase it. Thanks, Bjorn. Bjorn smiled proudly. In his mind, he'd been incredibly helpful today. Every prize had to make it back to the ships. With the village secured, the Vikings began carrying their spoils back to the waiting longships. After everything that happened, the chief trusted Bjorn with the safest job imaginable: standing still. While the rest of the Vikings worked tirelessly to load the spoils, Bjorn was still trying to figure out what his assignment actually was. With everyone else busy loading the ships, Bjorn found the only job he truly excelled at: falling asleep. No one wanted to wake him. They all remembered how helpful he had been earlier. Even by Viking standards, this was becoming difficult to tolerate. Instead of punishing Bjorn the usual way, the chief came up with a much more creative lesson. The chief had promised Bjorn a lesson he would never forget. Fortunately for the crew, Bjorn was still asleep for the setup. Without waking him, the Vikings secured Bjorn's little boat behind the fleet. The first part of the chief's plan had gone surprisingly smoothly. No speeches, no shouting, just one swing of the axe and then Bjorn was on his own. For Vikings, the sea could be deadlier than the enemy. After sleeping through almost the entire raid, Bjorn finally opened his eyes. Unfortunately, the rest of the fleet was nowhere to be seen. With every passing wave, the fleet grew smaller on the horizon, and Bjorn finally realized this wasn't part of the plan. For perhaps the first time all day, Bjorn gave something his full attention. Every stroke brought him a little closer to the fleet. Before long, someone aboard the fleet spotted a familiar little boat struggling through the waves. Bjorn had actually caught up. When Bjorn finally caught up, the crew welcomed him back with cheers, laughter, and more than a few friendly jokes. The crew laughed, patted Bjorn on the back, and made sure he'd never forget the day he had to row halfway across the sea. With the lesson learned and the laughter shared, the Vikings set sail for home together, leaving the adventure behind, but not the stories. Bjorn is fictional, but the Viking age was very real.